Look carefully at what's unfolding right now on Ukraine's southern front, because the geopolitical implications are staggering. Russian forces have been systematically advancing throughout 2024, capturing over 4,000 square kilometers in the eastern and southeastern regions. But the real story is what this means for the strategic corridor connecting Crimea to Russia's mainland. Moscow's capture of Vuhledar in October removed a Ukrainian stronghold that had held since 2022, and now the operational momentum is shifting southward. Here's what most analysts are missing. Odessa isn't just another city on the Black Sea, it's the linchpin of Ukraine's maritime access, its economic gateway to the world, and symbolically, the jewel of the Russian Empire's historic southwest. If Russian forces continue their methodical advance through southern Donetsk and Zaporizhia, the distance to Odessa becomes a tactical question rather than a strategic impossibility. The West isn't preparing for this scenario, but they should be. We're watching the potential reshaping of the entire Black Sea security architecture, and the clock is ticking faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. What comes next will determine whether Ukraine remains a viable state or becomes a landlocked buffer zone. So let's drill down into what this really means, because the implications here go far deeper than most people in Washington or Brussels want to acknowledge. We're watching something profound unfold along Ukraine's southern corridor, and the Western media narrative is doing what it always does, downplaying the strategic significance until it's too late to do anything about it. This isn't just about one city or one front. This is about the entire architecture of what Ukraine can be going forward, and whether it even remains a functional state with economic viability. Think about what's actually happened over the course of 2024. Russian forces captured roughly 4,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, and while that might not sound like much when you're looking at a map of a country as large as Ukraine, the devil is always in the details. Most of that territory came in the final months of the year, from September through November, and it wasn't random, it was methodical. Vuhledar fell in October, removing one of the most significant defensive positions Ukraine had held since the beginning of this conflict. That single stronghold had anchored the entire southern Donetsk defensive line. Once it collapsed, the geometry of the battlefield changed fundamentally. Now here's where people need to pay attention, because this is where the strategic picture comes into focus. Russian control of Odessa would give Moscow complete dominance over Ukraine's Black Sea coast and significant leverage over the West. We're not talking about a symbolic victory here. We're talking about economic strangulation. Ukraine exported 65% of its grain through Odessa and surrounding ports before the war. Think about that for a moment. 2/3 of Ukraine's agricultural exports, its economic lifeblood, flow through this one corridor. Without Odessa, Ukraine doesn't just lose a city. It loses its ability to function as a modern economy. It becomes landlocked, dependent entirely on overland routes through Poland and Romania, which are already strained beyond capacity. The West likes to talk about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, but nobody wants to discuss what happens when Ukraine's revenue streams dry up completely. During the peak of Russia's naval blockade from February to July 2022, Ukraine lost $170 million per day. Per day. That's the cost of being cut off from maritime trade. Now imagine that becoming permanent. Imagine Ukraine trying to sustain a war economy, rebuild infrastructure, service its debts, and maintain basic government functions without access to the Black Sea. It doesn't work. It can't work. And Moscow knows this better than anyone. Let's talk about the land bridge to Transnistria, because this is another piece of the puzzle that Western analysts consistently underestimate. Russian military commander Rustam Minakayev stated in April 2022 that Russia intended to establish a land corridor through southern Ukraine to Transnistria. At the time, people dismissed this as aspirational talk, propaganda meant to intimidate. But look at what's happened since. Every major Russian offensive in the south has been oriented toward this exact objective. Mariupol, Melitopol, Kherson, these weren't random targets. They were stepping stones in a carefully planned campaign to link Crimea with Transnistria, creating a continuous Russian-controlled zone across Ukraine's entire southern flank. Transnistria itself is this bizarre Soviet relic, a frozen conflict zone that most Americans couldn't find on a map if their lives depended on it. It's a narrow strip of land between Moldova and Ukraine, officially part of Moldova, but functioning as a Russian protectorate since the early 1990s. About 1,500 Russian troops are stationed there nominally as peacekeepers, but everyone understands what they really are. A tripwire, a forward position, a strategic foothold. If Russia can connect overland to Transnistria, it doesn't just encircle Ukraine's south, it puts a knife to Moldova's throat and extends its sphere of influence all the way to the Danube, to Romania's border to NATO's doorstep. This is classic geopolitical chess, and Putin has been playing it for years while the West stumbles from one crisis to the next with no coherent strategy. Catherine the Great founded Odessa in 1795 as part of the Russian Empire's drive to secure warm water ports and dominate the Black Sea. For more than 2 centuries, it was Russia's window to the Mediterranean, its commercial gateway to Europe and beyond. The Soviets understood its strategic value. Modern Russia understands it even better. This isn't about nostalgia or imperial ambition for its own sake. This is about controlling trade routes, energy flows, and economic choke points that determine who has power in this region for the next century. Now let's address the military realities on the ground, because that's where theory meets practice. The current front lines in southern Ukraine have been relatively stable since the Ukrainian counteroffensive recaptured Kherson in November 2022. But stable doesn't mean static. Russian forces have been systematically degrading Ukrainian defensive positions through constant artillery bombardment, drone strikes, and what military analysts call reconnaissance by fire. They're probing for weaknesses, identifying where Ukraine's defenses are thin, where ammunition is running low, where morale is cracking. In December of this year, Russian forces began carrying out assaults to gain footholds on islands in the Dnipro River Delta, and officials reported Moscow assembled 300 boats to cross the river. 300 boats. Think about what that means in operational terms. That's not a raid. That's not a probing attack. That's preparation for a major river crossing operation. The kind of thing that requires months of planning, massive logistics, and serious intent. The Dnipro River has been the natural barrier protecting Kherson and points west since Ukrainian forces liberated the city. If Russian forces can establish bridgeheads on the western bank, that barrier collapses, and once you lose the river line, the terrain between the Dnipro and Odessa is relatively flat, relatively open. There are defensive positions, of course, but nothing like the fortified zones in the Donbass. Here's something else people need to understand about modern warfare. It's not World War II. You can't just look at maps and measure distances and assume that's how military campaigns unfold. The decisive factor isn't always how many tanks you have or how many soldiers you can throw into an assault. It's logistics, it's command and control, it's the ability to sustain operations over time. And right now, Ukraine is running on fumes. Western aid packages keep getting delayed. Ammunition stockpiles are dangerously low. Trained personnel are increasingly scarce. Meanwhile, Russia has shifted to a full war economy. They're producing artillery shells at rates that dwarf anything NATO countries can manage. They're fielding new units, rotating troops through the front to give them combat experience, building up reserves. The arithmetic here is brutal but simple. Russia lost an estimated 420,000 casualties in 2024 to gain that 4,000 square kilometers of territory. That's more than 100 casualties per square kilometer. In any conventional analysis, those are catastrophic losses. But here's the thing, Russia can sustain those losses in ways Ukraine cannot. Russia has 3 times the population, a centralized authoritarian system that can enforce conscription without worrying about public opinion, and an industrial base that, while crude and inefficient by Western standards, is optimized for exactly this kind of grinding attritional warfare. Ukraine, by contrast, is struggling to maintain force levels. Mobilization is increasingly unpopular. Every village has lost sons, fathers, brothers. The average age of soldiers at the front keeps creeping upward because young men are fleeing the country or finding ways to avoid the draft. This isn't a criticism of Ukrainian courage or commitment, far from it. The Ukrainian military has performed brilliantly given the circumstances, achieving things most Western analysts thought impossible. But courage doesn't produce artillery shells. Determination doesn't replace casualties. At some point, the math catches up with you. And this is where the southern front becomes absolutely critical. In the Donbass, Ukraine can trade space for time. Those are industrial wastelands, towns already destroyed, terrain that's been fought over for years. It's valuable for symbolic and political reasons. But losing another 10 or 20 kilometers in Donetsk doesn't fundamentally alter Ukraine's viability as a state. Odessa is different. Odessa is existential. Whoever controls Odessa controls the entrance to the Danube River, which forms a link between Russia and Central Europe. Lose Odessa, and Ukraine isn't just weakened, it's functionally dismembered. Let's game this out. Suppose Russian forces launch a major offensive toward Mykolaiv in the spring of 2025. They've got fresh troops, adequate ammunition, and the Ukrainian defenders are exhausted from 3 years of war. Mykolaiv falls after a month of heavy fighting. That's about 150 kilometers from Odessa. In operational terms, that's nothing. That's a week or two if Ukrainian defenses collapse. Now Russian forces are approaching Odessa itself. What happens? Well, first, you'd see a mass exodus of civilians, probably 1 million people or more trying to flee westward. Roads would be clogged, trains overwhelmed, humanitarian catastrophe. Then you'd see a battle for the city itself, and urban combat is always the bloodiest, messiest form of warfare. But here's the key question. Does Ukraine have the forces available to mount a serious defense of Odessa, while simultaneously holding the line in the Donbass, maintaining the Kursk salient in Russia, and defending against potential Russian offensives in Zaporizhzhia or Kharkiv? The answer is no. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the reserves. Something would have to give. And if Odessa falls, the geopolitical consequences ripple outward like an earthquake. Moldova immediately faces an existential crisis, because now there's a continuous Russian-controlled corridor from Crimea to Transnistria. Romania, a NATO member, suddenly has Russian forces on its border. The Black Sea becomes a Russian lake. Turkey has to recalculate its entire strategic position. The grain supplies that feed North Africa and the Middle East, markets that are already unstable, already facing food security crisis, get disrupted again. You could see political upheaval in Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, mass migration waves toward Europe. This is why I keep saying that what happens in Odessa matters far more than most people realize. It's not just about Ukraine. It's about the entire post-Cold War security architecture in Eastern Europe. It's about whether NATO's eastern flank is defensible. It's about whether the European Union can maintain stability on its periphery. And it's about whether the United States still has the will and the capacity to shape events in this part of the world, or whether we're entering a new era where regional powers like Russia can redraw borders through force of arms and the West just issue statements of concern. Now, the optimists will tell you I'm being too pessimistic, that Ukrainian forces are more resilient than I'm giving them credit for, that Western support will continue, that Russia's own vulnerabilities will catch up with it. And maybe they're right. Wars are unpredictable. Things can turn on a dime, but strategy requires planning for realistic scenarios, not hopeful ones. And the realistic scenario right now is that Russia has strategic initiative in the south, Ukraine is on the defensive with dwindling resources, and the trajectory is pointing toward a Russian attempt to seize Odessa within the next 12 to 18 months. Could it happen overnight? Not literally, no. Modern militaries don't just appear outside cities without warning, but could it happen faster than most people expect, in a matter of weeks rather than months, once Russian forces begin a serious push? Absolutely. That's what the title of this analysis means. The groundwork is being laid right now, the force concentrations are building, the logistics are being positioned. When Russia decides the time is right, the operation could unfold with shocking speed, and suddenly everyone will be asking how we didn't see it coming. The answer is we did see it coming, or we could have if anyone was paying attention to the fundamentals rather than the daily headlines. The signs are all there. The question is whether anyone in Washington, Brussels, or Kiev has a plan to prevent it, because right now, from where I'm sitting, analyzing the strategic realities with clear eyes, I don't see one. And that should terrify anyone who cares about European security, about international law, about the basic principle that borders shouldn't be rewritten through military conquest in the 21st century. Odessa is the prize. Moscow knows it. The only question is whether the West will figure it out before it's too late.